Rian Johnson is an American director best known recently for directing Knives Out. His new movie Knives Out 2 is coming out on Netflix. And before that, he directed one of the most controversial films in a franchise called Star Wars The Last Jedi. This film divided the entire fan base. You either love it or you hate it. And when The Last Jedi was about to release, Lucasfilm announced that Rian Johnson will be getting his own trilogy in the Star Wars universe, separate from the Skywalker movies, but also in the Star Wars universe, directed and written by Rian Johnson. But because of the backlash of The Last Jedi, and also the poor reception of the Rise of Skywalker, the Rian Johnson trilogy was eventually canceled. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about why we Star Wars fans were robbed of a trilogy by Rian Johnson. Yeah, that's controversial to say, but it's kind of the truth. But before we begin, subscribe to the YouTube channel right there so you don't miss out on the release of our second feature-length film, The Hollywood Dream. It comes out exclusively on this YouTube channel for free, no ads. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Anyway, let's get started. Now, the first thing we have to talk about is The Last Jedi. More specifically, the fact that The Last Jedi, as a standalone movie, is really, really good. But because it's the second installment in the sequel trilogy, that's where it started to suck. Pause. I didn't mean it like that. Anyway, The Last Jedi, if you watch that as a standalone movie, you have to appreciate the quality of that film. The cinematography looked really amazing. The acting was incredible too. Luke Skywalker, Mark Hamill, he acted the best in this movie. Same with, all the other characters. Daisy Ridley, Kylo Ren, Adam Driver. I don't know why I said his character's name. Even Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia, had a pretty good moment in there where, her ship got destroyed, essentially, kind of, and, she got sucked into space. That sequence was really well done, except for the fact that they brought her, she used the Force to levitate back into the ship. That part was kind of doo-doo, but, before that, it was really, really good. But yeah, I can see why Lucasfilm was impressed by Rian Johnson and wanted to give him an entire trilogy, because in The Last Jedi, he did a really good job of making a really good film. The only complaints about the film, besides the fact that it didn't match with The Force Awakens, the only criticism was the subplot between Finn and Rose on that planet, and finding the code breaker, or whatever it was called. If you cut that out, you really had a solid movie in there. And that's the thing with Rian Johnson. Let's talk about Rian Johnson as a filmmaker. He made Looper, he made Knives Out, and he made The Last Jedi. Those three films are one of, his top three well-known films. Looper was really cool. It had a really interesting plot, and he did a pretty good job of making a good movie out of that. And Knives Out, obviously, is one of his biggest movies, besides Star Wars. So big, in fact, that Netflix acquired the rights to the sequels. He's going to make part 2 and part 3 to Knives Out, so you can tell a pretty lucrative franchise right there, all in the mind of Rian Johnson. And yeah, all this to say is that Rian Johnson is not a bad director. He is not a bad writer. He was just cursed with the sequel trilogy. That's all it is. The sequel trilogy is the curse here. So now let's look at the sequel trilogy. So let's start with The Force Awakens. This movie was essentially the reboot of Star Wars, while also not being a reboot. If you play The Force Awakens side by side with A New Hope, you can see a lot of similarities with the plot points. So essentially, it is a reboot, and it was done to pretty much rebuild Star Wars from the backlash of the prequel trilogy. And then Rian Johnson was able to have full creative control over the sequel to The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi. Rian Johnson essentially took that to his advantage and created a movie that he thought would be really good, and he also made sure that it would divide the audience. There was an old interview with Rian Johnson where he talked about how, in his mind, a successful film is a film that creates division with the audience that watches it. I can see why he agrees with that idea. I can see that. But with The Last Jedi, the only reason why it didn't work is because it's the second part to the trilogy. You're telling a story that has to connect and make sense with The Force Awakens, and whatever The Force Awakens was trying to establish. A lot of things in The Last Jedi were done to, famously subvert expectations. And in some cases, it worked really well, like with Snoke dying. That was perfect. In my opinion, I love that. But in other instances, it doesn't really work, like with Rey's parents not being anybody. That didn't work because The Force Awakens was heavily leaning on that mystery of who Rey's parents are. Once again, The Last Jedi as a standalone movie, separate from everything else, it works really well, but It doesn't work because it is part of a trilogy. It needs to connect with The Force Awakens. It needs to make The Force Awakens make sense, as well as build off of The Force Awakens. And of course, all the things that fans didn't like about The Last Jedi, the Rise of Skywalker, the sequel to The Last Jedi, tried to retcon. And the result is you have a really messy trilogy there. Nothing makes sense. And I talk about the sequel trilogy more in depth in my video. You can click right there to watch it. But yeah, in my opinion though, if Rian Johnson got his own trilogy separate from everything else, his own 3-film trilogy in the Star Wars universe, I feel like we would have a really, really cool, sets of movies there. Rian Johnson has proven to be a really good filmmaker. His name is just stained in the Star Wars universe because of The Last Jedi and the problems of the sequel trilogy as a whole. The main problem of the sequel trilogy, this is no brainer, the main problem is the lack of planning with all 3 films. But if Rian Johnson was able to be in full creative control of 3 films separate from the other movies, his own trilogy, I think we would have an amazing sets of movies, like I said before. So yes, don't think that The Last Jedi being what it is because of Rian Johnson. Rian Johnson just tried to make a good movie. The reason why The Last Jedi didn't work is because of the lack of planning from the producers. That's why The Last Jedi is not that good. So what I'm trying to say is that we've been robbed of potentially a really good trilogy in Star Wars with Rian Johnson.
You are watching a master.